In this session, we're going to take a look at EventSentry's performance monitoring functionality that's part of system health. But before I go into the details on how to configure performance monitoring, I want to show an overview on how this feature works, what its capabilities are, and how you can do a lot more than just monitor the performance of Windows counters. Performance monitoring allows you to source data from 3 different sources. The first one and the most obvious one are, of course, Windows performance counters. So this would be things like CPU usage, disk utilization, memory usage, and so forth. Now, any performance counter that Windows makes available can be monitored with EventSentry. So if there are custom counters that are only available with a certain software, for example, let's say SQL Server counters, then you can monitor those as well, as long as they're available. The second source that EventSentry can utilize are SNMP counters, and that's usually something that you would use with network devices and non-Windows machines. So we're talking about firewalls, switches, printers, as well as Linux and Unix machines. And then the third source that you can also utilize, and that's fairly new, is you can use the output from any sort of command line application or script as input into EventSentry and utilize that as a source. That pretty much gives you unlimited capabilities and allows you to source any type of data there is and feed it into EventSentry. For example, you can monitor Docker containers. You can obtain information from a website, like the temperature, for example, in a city. You can gather information from locally connected temperature sensors and so forth. So really anything that you can programmatically read from the computer, you can feed it into EventSentry. And the beauty about this whole system is that all of this data, it's being treated equally, meaning that you configure it, of course, separately. But once the data is obtained by EventSentry, it's all viewed and handled in exactly the same way. So it doesn't really matter whether data is coming from relates to the CPU usage of a server, or the network bandwidth of a router, or the temperature in a city that you obtain through a website. Because all that information goes into performance monitoring and is then displayed and queried in exactly the same way. So once you have that data, you can of course do the usual reporting. You can view charts. You can review the actual raw numerical data. You can set up alerts. You can say, okay, if that counter exceeds a certain value or is below a certain value or is not between a range, for example, that you want to get an alert. And of course, then you have the full flexibility with EventSentry to dispatch these alerts to whomever you want. So you could send certain alerts to one person, certain other alerts to another person. And of course, then we also have very flexible dashboards. So you can create dashboards for the information that you have received. So for example, in our demo, we have a dashboard that shows you the temperature, pollution, and so forth from certain cities in the United States, or temperatures from 4 different areas in the world. So even though those have nothing to do with actual Windows performance counters, you can source that data and display it and use it in exactly the same way. But let's take a look at how this is actually going to be configured in EventSentry. So here I'm in the management console. I have the system health container already expanded, and I can filter the packages based on type and just say, okay, I just want to see performance packages. So now I only see performance packages. And like I mentioned earlier, so here we have a package, for example, for SQL Server. So that will of course only work if you have a SQL Server installed and it's configured accordingly, automatically activated if that system exists. Similar thing would be happening, for example, with Active Directory. If we look at this, we'll see that this is only active on a domain controller. So these packages are automatically assigned, nothing to really do there. The core packages that you'll want to start off with, most likely, is the performance system and the performance application. So performance system, as the name implies, gives you insight into the performance of all your systems. If we can see here, we're looking at counters like CPU, memory, network, page file, disk queue length, and so forth. The other one we have is that gives you insight into all applications that are running on a system. That is memory utilization, the handle count, and the CPU usage of applications. When you look at this list here, you can see what type of counters are configured here. So these are all just Windows counters. So these would only be running on the Windows server or workstation or domain controller, of course. But if we look at these here, then we can see that some of these counters actually have /SNMP. So what that means is that these counters are querying not only Windows performance counters, but also SNMP counters. So if this package is assigned to a network device, then EventSentry, of course, will automatically know, okay, so this is not a Windows machine, and it will try to obtain that data via SNMP instead. So let's take a look, for example, at the first one here, most obvious one, CPU utilization. So here, this is grayed out because this is actually a built-in counter that you cannot remove because that data is utilized in a lot of our dashboards. So this is grayed out, hard-coded, cannot be changed. But if we look at the data here, we can see that the performance data is being obtained every 5 seconds. We can see here again, okay, this is a Windows and a SNMP counter. We can switch this down to SNMP and we'll actually see the SNMP OID that it's querying, and so in this particular case it's actually combining two values, a user and system CPU data. Nothing configured for the executable, of course, that's why it's empty. And the Windows counter is a number here so that it's compatible with any Windows OS language and not just English. And you can see down here what the counter description is, processor time. So this is the core, this is the basic of this counter that we're monitoring. And as you can see here, and I'll show this in a different counter, you can also do calculations with a second counter. But before we get into that, let's take a look at the other two tabs we have here. So the first one here is alert. All right. So once you collect the counter, so the general tab just tells us, okay, this is the counter data that we want to obtain. We're obtaining it every 5 seconds. And now there's two things we can do with that. We can either issue alerts or we can store that data in a database. So with alerts, of course, we're going to say, okay, enable the alert, configure the severity, and then we have the option of saying, okay, we want to alert if the value is more than, less than, equal, between, or not equal a certain value. So more than and less than obviously makes sense when we look at numerical values like memory utilization or CPU utilization. Between and not between is also, I think, straightforward. Sometimes we have ranges of data that are good, and if it's not within the range, then we want to get alerted, or vice versa. And equal or not equal, well, that's mostly useful for SNMP counters. Sometimes an SNMP counter can indicate a certain situation, such as a RAID status, for example. Then we want to know if the number is equal or not equal, for example, that number. So, for example, a Synology disk station may say that the RAID status is 1, which indicates that the RAID is okay. And if it's not 1, well, then we want to know about it. Here we also say, so then we configure the actual limit, so 90% for CPU, of course, for 30 minutes. So if the value is more than 90 for 30 minutes, then we want to get an alert, and we'll get an alert every hour if that counter continues to be elevated. And if it's an email, of course, you can get alerts in many ways, but if you're getting an email alert, then we also have, embedding a chart with those email alerts. I'm going to leave these options here for a later video. And instead, we're going to look at the history and trending. So this is pretty straightforward again. First, we activate it, and we're actually saying, okay, we want to record the value in the database every 5 minutes. Now, keep in mind that what's being recorded in the database is, of course, the average. So since we're collecting the data every 5 seconds, that means we'll have 12 data points every minute. And we're collecting it, we're only writing it every 5 minutes. So that means we will have 60 data points. So EventSentry will calculate the average of those 60 data points and write it to the database every 5 minutes. Keep history. So this goes back to what I was explaining earlier. If we're looking at, for example, if you're monitoring SNMP counters, where you don't really care so much about the history, then you can uncheck this. Another option, for example, would be the toner level of printers, right? So many enterprise printers make their toner level available via SNMP. So this may be useful if you want to create a dashboard or get notified if the toner level is low, but you may not necessarily need to see the history or see trend charts of these toner levels. So then you can uncheck that box. The same thing for for status values, like is the RAID okay or not. Generally speaking, you don't have to store this information in the database. For example, disk station is going to log that the RAID is okay every 5 minutes. There's no point in logging that same data for days and weeks and months. And then, of course, you simply configure the database where this data is being written to, and you can define multiple databases here as well. And you may have noticed that on the bottom here, we have the current value of these CPU counters. The number inside the brackets are actually the instances, so these would be the CPU cores that the EventSentry is iterating through. So once we have the performance counters configured, they'll be written to the database. We can look here, for example, at this default dashboard here. You can see that we have 3 tiles here. For example, top CPU, consumption, memory, and handle count. This actually comes from these counters here, but gives you a quick overview over the most resource-intensive applications on your network in terms of CPU, memory, and handle count. You can see here that these Docker systems use a lot of handles. You can also review the charts here on the features performance, and there we have 3 different options: current, history, and trends. So current will give you a current status of any performance counter. So if we say just CPU, for example, and we want to look at the total instance, then we have 27 values. I can click on details here, expand this to include all objects, and here we have the value of all counters. So you can expand this here a little bit. It's ordered by computer, and here we have the values of every monitored machine at a glance. You can also see the actual counters that are being utilized. If you want to visualize this, then let's pick a machine here that has a little bit more usage. So the server 2 2019. So I can go back here, or I can either go back here, click on performance and go to trends, or I can click this button here. So this will bring us to the charts page. We can see all the counters that are available on that system with that server, of course, that we clicked on being selected, but we can select different servers here as well. We can make this a little bit more granular. I can click on minutes. So now I have a slightly more granular chart. And I can just say, oh, you know what? I want to see the last week. And we can see that here. So it's very easy to visualize the CPU utilization right here. We can also switch this view to not look at the actual host, but the counter. So if we switch this to the counter perspective, then now we have the same data here again as before, but now we can compare the data with different servers. So if I switch to or select the EventSentry server here, then I can actually see the CPU utilization from both machines and compare that. So that's pretty useful. You can add as many machines as you would like, of course, however much is useful. For the heck of it, we can add one of those Docker machines here and see what that looks like. And we'll see here that the CPU utilization is much higher here with one spike here that goes really high. And we can go back and say, okay, well, let's just look at the last 2 days and also have a nice little comparison here. And we have other ways to change this. Instead of area graphs, we can just have line graphs. We can also look at the raw data. So if we wanted to say, okay, we don't really want to visualize it, we want to actually look at the actual numbers that are being recorded, then we can do that as well. For example, let's take a look at LDAP searches from the domain controller. And here we can look at the actual values that are being returned from the last hour. We can make this a little bit larger. And now we can look at the actual raw values. So no charts, just the values. So if you're really looking for something very specific, maybe you're getting SNMP data from some scientific device or whatnot, then you can actually look at the raw values here as well. So that's it for the overview of EventSentry's performance monitoring capabilities. Other videos, we're going to look at actual counters, adding counters, setting up alerts, and so forth.